Well, it's good to see you guys this morning. My name is Kent. If we hadn't had the chance to meet, I'm one of our pastors. If you have a Bible, turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 13. 2 Samuel chapter 13. Good? That was fun. So I have a friend who we'll call Terry. Terry grew up in and around the church. From as early as she can remember, she and her parents were in the pews every time the doors were open. She loves the church. To this day, some of her fondest memories from her childhood were running around in the grass outside of this old country church where they grew up, playing tag with all of her friends while her parents sort of stood around and talked and caught up with each other. But when Terry was 9 years old, she was sexually abused by her second cousin, who was a part of that church. He was 8 years older than her and was heavily involved with the youth ministry there. Terry knew enough at the time to know that something wrong had happened, but she didn't have the language for what it was or what exactly was wrong about it. She also suspected, for some reason, that if she came forward about it and told anyone, not only would he be angry with her cousin, but many people in the church would probably be angry with her too. She also had this lingering feeling that somehow, for some reason, what had happened was at least partially her fault. So shortly after the abuse occurred, Terry made a decision that she convinced herself was a noble decision. And that was not to tell anybody about what happened. But doing that had some unintended consequences for her. She became less and less interested in church, especially as she approached the age where she would become a part of the youth group there. Terry began to cope with the internalized shame that she felt in a number of different ways. First, it was isolating herself from friends her age. Then it became self-injury in her teenage years, then drinking, and then eventually substances as she entered college. Her junior year of college, she stumbled into a church nearby because they fed college students lunch after the service, and she was out of money to buy food. While she was there, another college student asked if she could pray for Terry. That began a friendship where Terry eventually felt comfortable enough to share parts of her story with this other girl. And upon hearing her story, this other student gave her a book to read all about how the message of Jesus brings healing to those who are survivors of sexual assault. To Terry, the idea that the same message that she had heard her entire life might actually apply to her specific situation in specific sorts of ways was brand new information. She had never heard that aspect of the gospel preached, even though she had been in church her entire life. To this day, she calls that book the most hopeful book she's ever read. Today, we close out a 5-week series that we've been in this summer called Theology of Sex. And we're going to do that by talking about the reality of sexual assault. My hope is that this teaching can be helpful in a similar way to how that book was helpful for Terry. Not that what I'm going to say this morning is going to magically fix anything, but that it will help people in this room along their journey. In my opinion, any series on the topic of sex must at least acknowledge this topic. If for no other reason than because it is a reality for so many people in our world. As we mentioned a couple weeks ago in the teaching, an estimated 1 in 4 women and 1 in 5 men will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. That number is almost certainly low because of how notoriously underreported sexual assault is. So some estimates actually put the number at closer to half of women and a third of men. Suffice it to say, sexual assault impacts a lot of people. Even if you have not personally experienced it, it's almost certain that you know somebody who has. And for most people, sexual assault has a profound impact on how they think about sex, how they think about their own sexuality, how they experience sexual desire and the lack thereof. So this morning, I want to try to discuss a little bit of all of that. And part of the reason that I want us to do that within the church is because I'm concerned that as followers of Jesus, we may not be fully aware of how directly relevant the truth of the gospel is to those who have experienced sexual assault. My hope is that by talking some about this morning, maybe we can at least begin the process of hope and healing for many people in this room and hopefully continue it for others. But all that said, as Colton mentioned, this morning will obviously be heavy. I don't really have any jokes or self-deprecating humor planned as I typically would, even though there is so much material of that latter category, just because that doesn't really seem very appropriate for the subject matter this morning. I am going to do my best to make it through this teaching without falling apart. But no promises. Because every time I sat down to work on this teaching, it was tough for me to get through more than a few paragraphs without just breaking down. Because to me, this teaching represents real people in my life. Friends of mine, family members of mine, members of our church who have experienced this. So it is not easy to talk about. But my hope is that this morning is that as difficult as it may be to discuss, it can be helpful to some of us in this room. So I'm going to pray for us and then we'll begin. Father, we are fully aware today that there are a lot of things in our world that are not like they should be. We hate that we live in a world where sexual assault and abuse exist. We hate that sin has so corrupted the hearts of some people that they would commit such a devastating thing against someone else. And I know that many of us in this room have been personally affected by that reality, and so I pray this morning would be helpful. I have no expectation that anything I say will magically fix any of us in the room or take away any of what we've experienced. But I do pray that it would be helpful. I pray that you would, for many people, at least begin the process of healing and restoration. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So start with some definitions. Sexual assault is defined by the U.S. Department of Health as simply any unwanted sexual activity. That's it in a nutshell. Another popular definition out there with, I think, a little more helpful detail in it is, quote, any type of sexual behavior or contact where consent is not freely given or obtained and is accomplished through force, intimidation, violence, coercion, manipulation, threat, deception, or abuse of authority. So any sexual behavior or contact accomplished through any of those means is sexual assault. We've already mentioned how common sexual assault is among the larger population. What compounds the issue, though, is that far too often sexual assault happens within the church. A year and a half ago, the U.S. Department of Justice actually opened an investigation into the Southern Baptist Convention over a perceived mishandling of sexual abuse cases among its leaders. The Catholic Church at this point has become almost notorious for covering up sexual abuse committed by its clergy. And many of us could likely name right now multiple high-profile Christian leaders out there in our country who have been credibly accused of sexual assault in the past 5 to 10 years. Far too often sexual abuse occurs within the church. And even when the church is not guilty of it, we are too often silent about it. I can't tell you how many people, upon hearing that we were going to do a whole week of this series about sexual assault, told me in response that they had never heard a church talk at length about sexual assault before. Which, if I'm completely honest, is baffling to me. It grieves me to know that because of the damage that I know the silence can cause. And again, by no means can I fix all of these problems today. Anything I say up here today is at best a drop in the bucket. But my hope is that we can at least open a conversation about it in our church. My hope is that by talking about it today, we can at least push back against the culture of silence within the church on this topic. And the way we're going to go about that is by actually reading an account of sexual assault from the pages of the Bible in 2 Samuel 13. Now, I realize as we do that reading something like this may be very difficult for many of you in the room, especially if you've experienced sexual assault before. But here's what I'll say. If you can hang in there with me as we work through this passage, I can promise you there is a reason that we are walking through a heavy story like this one. I think this story from the scriptures actually shows us a lot about the nature of sexual assault, the damage that it causes and why, and I think points us in a very helpful direction as to what to do about it all. And if you haven't experienced something like this yourself, I think there's also tremendous insight in this story into the reality of sexual assault that you can learn from in this passage. So I think this passage can actually teach all of us a good bit. So as we read through it, I'll stop periodically and just make some observations about what's going on that I think will be helpful. So let's take a look, 2 Samuel 13, starting in verse 1. Here's what it says. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. So Amnon, who is the son of King David, starts noticing his half-sister Tamar. And right out of the gate, we are reminded of one very ugly reality about sexual assault, and that's that the abuser is very often someone the victim knows. So the stereotype of a dark, shadowy, unknown figure in an alleyway actually isn't all that common. It certainly can happen, but most perpetrators of sexual assault are someone familiar to the victim, sometimes a member of their own family, sometimes it can even be a spouse, a romantic partner of the victim. Here in this story that we read about, it's Tamar's half-brother named Amnon. It says that Amnon fell in love with Tamar, but this obviously isn't a normal type of attraction at all. Something is actually deeply wrong here, something deeply dysfunctional. We see more of that as the passage continues in verse 2. Amnon became so obsessed, it says, with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. So this is really more like a warped fixation towards her than it is an attraction. Amnon is specifically just attracted to her sexually and doesn't care much at all about her beyond her appearance and her sexual appeal. We can see that in his obsession over the fact that she is a virgin. Verse 3. Now Amnon had an advisor named Jonadab, son of Shemaiah, David's brother. So this is essentially Amnon's cousin he's talking to. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. That word could also be translated crafty, like the snake in the Garden of Eden. Verse 4, he asked Amnon, "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning? Won't you tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." So Jonadab responds, "Go to bed and pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so that I may watch her and then eat it from her hand.'" So Amnon tells his cousin about his obsession with Tamar, and they immediately start scheming together on how Amnon can use his power and his position to take advantage of his half-sister. And then Amnon puts the plan into motion. Verse 6. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight so that I might eat from her hand." David sent word to Tamar at the palace, "Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him." Verse 8, so Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. "Send everyone out of here," Amnon said. So everyone left. It's now just him and Tamar alone. Verse 10, then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food here into my bedroom so that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar put the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. So often, what will happen is that the abuser will use the victim's trust as a weapon against them. They're able to assault someone they know because they manipulate and take advantage of that other person's trust. So in the story, when Tamar comes to serve Amnon some bread, she thinks nothing of it because she trusts her half-brother. After all, he's a member of her own family. And when he sends everyone else out of the room except Tamar, she thinks nothing of it again because she trusts him. When he tells her to bring the food into his room, she does it because, again, she has no reason to believe that he has ulterior motives in what he's asking. She trusts him, and he uses that trust against her for his own purposes. Keep reading in verse 11. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, "Come to bed with me, my sister." "No, my brother," she said to him, "don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing." Make no mistake about it, sexual assault is a wicked thing. It isn't a misunderstanding. It is not a mistake. It is not boys being boys. It's not a temporary lapse in judgment. It is not any of those things. It is a wicked act of violence committed by one person against another person. It is making another human being made in the image of God a victim of your violence. It is seeing them as an object to satisfy your desires and impulses. It is without a doubt a wicked thing. A fact that Tamar is well aware of here. Look at the next question that she asked, verse 13. "What about me?" she says. "Where could I get rid of my disgrace?" Where could I get rid of my disgrace? So I want us to camp out for a moment on this question that Tamar asked. So when faced with the reality of her brother sexually assaulting her, she asked him this question: "If you do this to me, where could I get rid of my disgrace?" The word disgrace is what she uses to describe what he is attempting to do. And I think that word, if you think about it, is such a fitting term to describe what sexual assault is. And here's why. If you've been around church very long, you have likely heard someone define what grace is, right? You've probably heard someone say that grace is essentially unmerited favor. Right? That's what it means. Unmerited or undeserved favor. Grace is getting something incredible that you did not deserve at all. But if that's what grace is, then sexual assault is quite literally disgrace. It's the opposite of grace. Instead of getting something incredible that you didn't deserve, it's experiencing something horrible that you didn't deserve. It's quite literally disgrace. It's the opposite of grace. So knowing that, the question that Tamar asked her brother in this moment is, if you do this to me, where will I get rid of that disgrace as a result? How will I rid myself of this horrifying thing that you are attempting to do? For so many of survivors of assault that I have talked to, that is essentially the question lingering in their minds after it happens. How in the world can I ever get rid of what I feel as a result of all of this? How will this ever go away? How will this ever not affect so many other things in my life, so many other relationships that I have? That is the question that so many survivors are asking. Where can I get rid of that disgrace? We're going to circle back to that question in just a moment. For now, Tamar goes on, second half of verse 13. "And what about you?" she says to Amnon. "You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you." Now, this likely feels to us like a very odd thing for Tamar to say. But what's likely happening here is that she is just trying anything and everything she can to get out of the situation that she's in. She's already tried reasoning with Amnon, but it didn't work. It didn't slow him down. So now she's just saying anything she can to get out of the room where he is, to escape to safety. If she can get him to wait and talk to the king about marrying her, well, then that means she can flee to safety in the meantime. Verse 14. "But he refused to listen to her. And since he was stronger than she, he raped her. You know, for all the examples in the world of people covering up or minimizing sexual assault, especially when it involves a public figure, it is interesting to me that the Bible has no interest in covering anything up. It tells it exactly like it happened. I mean, think about it. Because of who Amnon is, because he's such a prominent figure, he's the son of the great Israelite King David. How easy would it have been for him for the Bible to say, well, there was an incident between the son and the king and Tamar, and we're not exactly sure what happened, so we don't talk a lot about it because we don't want to mar anybody's reputation unnecessarily. That is what so often happens in these situations in the world. But instead, the Bible tells it quite bluntly, just like it happened. It says, he raped her. And then there's this phrase before that where it says, since he was stronger than she. So much of the time, sexual assault involves some type of power differential from abuser to victim. Sometimes it's physical strength, like it is here in the story. Other times, it may just be that the organization or the social situation is set up in such a way that benefits the abuser over the victim. So a boss threatening to fire or demote someone unless something sexual occurs. A man who threatens to leave his wife or partner unless she does what he wants sexually. I've even heard of situations where the woman is the abuser and she tells the man that if he speaks up about what happens, she'll just tell everybody that it was the other way around and nobody will believe him. That too is a type of power differential. One way or another, in so many situations, there is some type of power differential from abuser to victim. Practically, this is why it is so unhelpful to ask questions of a survivor like, why didn't you fight back? Because the assumption there is that, one, they didn't try to fight back, which they very well may have, and two, it assumes that they had the ability and the strength to do so, when in fact, neither of those things may be true in the situation. Verse 15. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up and get out." In this verse, Amnon embodies the very epitome of sexual assault and what it is. Using a person as an object and then discarding them afterwards. It is the complete indifference to humanity and the other person. It's an indifference to their status as an image bearer of God. That is what assault is at the end of the day. It is functional, expressed hatred for the victim. Tamar's response, verse 16. "No," she said to him. "Sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you've already done to me." But he refused to listen to her. I don't know if you've noticed, that is the second time that the author used that phrase. He refused to listen to her. Anytime sexual contact occurs and one person refuses to listen to the other, no matter who it is, something harmful has occurred. Verse 17, he, Amnon, called his personal servant and said, "Get this woman out of my sight and bolt the door after her." So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. Amnon calls his servant and says, "Get this woman out of my sight." He doesn't call her by name, and the original language, it actually reads more like, "Get this out of my sight." It doesn't even acknowledge her humanity at all. And Amnon gets exactly what he wants. His personal servant comes and takes care of the whole situation for him. So Amnon, the abuser, gets protection, while Tamar, the one in need of protection, gets carted away. She gets disgrace, and he just moves on with his life. How many times have we seen that scenario play out? So much of the time. The system is rigged in favor of the abuser. Look at what happens next in the story, second half of verse 18. She was wearing an ornate robe, for this was the kind of garment that the virgin daughters of the king wore. Verse 19, Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe that she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. So this part also might seem a bit peculiar to us, but what she was doing here was essentially just an ancient form of mourning. She tears her robe. So Tamar is expressing on the outside what she feels on the inside. Her innocence, her purity, her sexuality feels like it has been ripped to shreds by what happened to her. And so as an expression of that, she physically tears apart the robe that she's wearing as a way of demonstrating that grief. And she goes away weeping. And then take a look at verse 20. Her brother Absalom said to her, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. So Absalom, knowing that something is wrong with his sister, says to Tamar one of the most unhelpful things that so many survivors hear after sexual assault. And those are the words, "Be quiet about this." I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of sexual assault where even when the survivor works up the unbelievable amount of courage that it takes to tell somebody, the first response that they get from the person they tell is, "Hey, let's not tell anybody else about this." Who have you told so far? Let's not make a big deal out of this whole thing. Let's not damage that other person's reputation. That so often is what survivors hear, and it's so unbelievably destructive to say. But here's what's ironic about the story. Absalom actually ends up taking revenge on Amnon for what he did to Tamar. 2 years later, Absalom actually murders Amnon as a result of this whole situation. But what's ironic about him doing that is that it doesn't actually help Tamar. Sure, he avenges her, but it doesn't actually bring her any healing. Justice is attempted, but it doesn't undo her experience of pain. So even though in some way Absalom thinks he is helping by doing this, he's actually not helping at all. And in the moment when Tamar most needs Absalom's help, when she tells him what happened, he silences her. And here's one reason why it's so harmful to silence survivors of sexual assault. It often solidifies the shame and isolation that they already feel. It implies to them that their abuser's reputation, that the status quo is more important than their own well-being and healing. It suggests that one of the most devastating things in their life is somehow not a big enough deal to talk about. And perhaps worse, it may very well imply that you think they're lying about what happened to them. By doing things like this, you are often pushing the survivor further into isolation, which they already feel unbelievable amounts of. And in the story, that's precisely what happens. It says that as a result of all of this, and as a result of not being able to talk about it, Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. That word can be translated there desolate, or even with the word devastated. And for what I've told, those are also fitting words to describe what survivors often feel. They feel as if their life has been permanently altered for the worse. They feel desolate, devastated by what happened to them. They may begin to feel that their trauma is one of the most defining parts of their identity, like it is this warped lens that distorts every other experience they have. And theologically, part of the reason that survivors often feel that way is because they have actually had the impact of someone else's sin placed onto them. That's what sexual assault is. It is to have the abuser's sin, their lust, their objectification, their violence, their hatred. It's to have all of that placed onto you as the survivor. It's to have to carry the effect of another person's sin on your shoulders. And with that, to have to carry the guilt, the shame, the uncleanness that really only that person should be carrying. You now have to unjustly experience what only they should have to experience. And it's extremely difficult to know what to do with that as a survivor. I mean, as followers of Jesus, we have a framework for what to do about our own sin, but what do we do about shame from someone else's sin? It's hard to know what to do with that in response. So in response, it's easy to feel as a survivor, in essence, desolate. Desolate because it feels like no one else knows what you are feeling. No one else understands what you're experiencing. So my question is, what does a person do with that experience as a survivor of assault? What do we do with it? Do we ignore it? Do we suppress it? Do we self-medicate through it? Something else? I mean, to use Tamar's very question in this passage, where does a survivor of sexual assault get rid of their disgrace? And what I want you to see this morning is that it's on this very question. What do I do with my disgrace? How do I get rid of my disgrace? It's on this very question that the gospel message is so very important for us to realize. Because here's the answer, and it's a multiple part answer. Scripture tells us first that there is another person who has experienced someone else's sin being placed on their shoulders. Someone who has unjustly experienced someone else's shame. Although Jesus may not have experienced sexual assault specifically, he certainly knows what it feels like to take on shame that was not his own. Isaiah 53 tells us that, quote, "The Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all." Even though the sin was not his own, though he did not deserve it in the least, Jesus experienced that sin being placed onto his shoulders. And not only that, but everything that came with it. He experienced the shame, the desolation, the devastation of another person's sin. He experienced the isolation when every close friend that he had turned on him. He experienced the unjustness of systems and structures of his day being rigged against him and in favor of those in power. He experienced being silenced by those in authority over him. And even on a physical level, he experienced the shame of being stripped naked and being powerless while people hurled their hatred and their violence at him. While Jesus may not have experienced exactly what you have experienced as a survivor of sexual assault, he has experienced some strikingly similar things. In fact, here's the way the rest of Isaiah chapter 53 puts it. About Jesus, it says, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living, desolate. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Jesus may not have experienced the exact thing that you experienced, but he can certainly identify with a whole lot of it. He knows how it feels to do nothing wrong and yet still have to experience the shame of someone who did. He knows exactly what that feels like. And so to you, survivor of sexual assault in the room, even though it may feel like no one else in the world could know what you're feeling, Jesus looks at you with tears in his eyes and he says, I'm there with you. And that's where our hope lies as followers of Jesus. Not that Jesus offers us some sort of easy fix or quick solution to the problem, but that he sees us in the depths of our pain and our suffering and our devastation and says to us, I know. One thing that I find so very comforting about the message of Jesus is that in it, God is no stranger to suffering. In every other world religion I know of, God or the gods remain distant in the comforts of another realm, distant from human suffering. But in Jesus, God himself volunteers for suffering. He signs up for it. He makes himself a victim of the brokenness of the world. He chooses to suffer at the hands of wicked, unjust human beings. God himself comes and allows himself to be wronged by the very creatures he created. God suffers with and alongside his people. And in doing that, he actually deals with all sin. including that of sexual assault. In that moment, he took the shame and the disgrace that you experienced as a survivor, and he broke the power of that too. It no longer has to be the most defining thing about you. It no longer has to be the lens through which you see everything else in your life. His work on the cross provided the foundation upon which you can begin to heal. It likely will be a process. It likely will take time, but because of Jesus, it is possible. The gospel message is not just hope for sinners, it's hope for those who have been sinned against. But I'll also say that for survivors of sexual assault, that is not even the end of the hope that we have through Jesus. It's not just that Jesus identifies with our suffering. It's not just that he makes the healing process possible. He also promises in the scriptures one day to heal us completely. I want you to look on the screen at a passage with me from Isaiah chapter 25. So in this passage of the prophet Isaiah, he is describing the day in the future where all forms of injustice are eradicated from the earth, which certainly includes the injustice of sexual assault. He's describing the day in the future when Jesus returns and sets everything right once for all. And here's how he describes that day. I want you to pay careful attention to the language here. It says in verse 8, he will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's, look at that next word, disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. He will take away people's disgrace from all the earth. So who will take away our disgrace? Jesus will. You see, Isaiah answers the question that Tamar asked. Before Amnon did what he did, she asked him, if you do this to me, where will I get rid of my disgrace? And Isaiah says, here's where you get rid of your disgrace. God promises that there is a day coming on the horizon when complete healing for all followers of Jesus will happen. When disgrace of all kinds will be gone for good for the people of God, where for followers of Jesus, he will wipe away every tear from every eye, where in the words of J.R.R. Tolkien, all sad things will come untrue. Follower of Jesus, there will come a day where your disgrace, your shame will be taken away for good. The one thing that feels like it will not ever go away will be put away forever. So hear me. Jesus identifies with you in your pain. He provides the means for you to begin healing, and one day he will heal you completely. That is the good news for survivors of sexual assault. And really, that's the good news for all of us as followers of Jesus. So before we close this morning, I'd like to just speak briefly at a practical level to two different groups of people here in the room. First, I want to speak to those of you who have experienced sexual assault. And second, I want to speak to those of you in the room who may have someone confide in you about their experience with sexual assault. First, I want to speak to the survivors. To the survivors in the room, I want to start off by saying what I do not think could ever be said enough, and that's that I'm sorry this happened to you. I am sorry that we live in a world where this exists. I am sorry that we live in a world where you feel like you don't have anybody you can talk to about it. I'm sorry if you have told someone and they've responded in really unhelpful ways. And I'm sorry that we as a society have still largely not learned how to respond to how common of a problem this is. None of that is okay. But all that said, here's what I would invite you to do if this is part of your story, if you haven't been able to thus far. When you're ready, when you feel like you can, tell somebody. Specifically, it might be helpful to tell someone who is a follower of Jesus, just because hopefully they can help point you to the stuff that we've been talking about today and what it looks like to really wrestle with it. But one of the worst things about sexual assault is often the isolation that happens as a result. It's how alone you can feel in it all. And we, with everything in us as a community, want you to not feel alone. So when you're ready, when you feel like you can, when you feel like you're able, tell someone. Now, there's a few different ways that that can happen. If you are in one of our life groups here at City Church, your life group leader would be a great person for you to tell, or someone in your life group. Your life group leaders have been equipped this week with some resources, have been coached up on how to respond well, and they would love to make themselves available to you to talk about what happened. They'd love to not only listen, but then walk alongside you in whatever steps you decide together will be helpful to take next. If you're here and you're not in a life group and you need someone to pray with or someone to talk to about this or anything else that you're dealing with in your life, our prayer team will have gold lanyards on. They'll be in the hallways directly behind me down here. They'll be at the top of the balconies in the front. They would love to pray with you and talk with you about whatever you've got going on, including something like this. And if you're here and you're not ready to tell someone yet, that's okay. More than anything, I just want you to know that our church desires to be a safe place for you when you decide you can. We are here and we want to listen. I am positive that we will not respond perfectly, but we want to respond well by God's grace. That's our commitment to you. So on that note, I'd like to speak briefly to others of us in the room, to those of us who might have someone confide in us about their experience with sexual assault. So let me just quickly give you a few things not to say and a few things to say. Just trying to be as practically helpful as possible here. A few things not to say are things like, I know exactly how you feel. Things like that sometimes feel like helpful things to say, but especially if you have not experienced sexual assault, it can seem like you're trying to minimize their experience. Not to mention, every person experiences the aftermath of sexual assault a little bit differently. So there's a good chance that even if you have had something similar happen to you, you still may not know exactly how they feel. In addition, I would encourage you not to say things like, you'll get over this, or it will all be okay, or try to be positive about it. Sexual assault, because of what it is, takes way more than just positive thinking to deal with. So just telling them to think a certain way or be optimistic as a response often is not a very helpful thing to say, even if it is well-intended. And please, 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 this one's really important to me as a pastor. Avoid Christian cliches in those moments like this was God's will, or God is going to use this. Whatever your theology is, even if you think you are making a true theological statement by saying those things, that absolutely is not what that person needs to hear in that moment. So those are some things not to say. Let me give you some helpful things to say instead. Some things to say would be things like, I'm sorry this happened to you. Things like, thank you for trusting me with this. Things like, this wasn't your fault. Things like, it's okay to cry, or even, I'd love to cry with you, or be with you as you cry. In my experience, one of the most helpful things that you can say as you process this with someone is something like, things may not ever be the same, but they absolutely can get better. And then, once you've processed some with them, when it feels right, I think asking a question like, how can I help? How can I be helpful to you? What next steps do you feel like would be good to take? And I'll add that one of the most helpful things you can do if someone confides in you about their experience is just promise and commit to be regularly available and present to them, whatever's next. How we respond to sexual assault is so incredibly important, especially in the church. It has the potential to set survivors on a path towards healing, so let's be incredibly intentional with how we approach it. It also has the potential to show a broken world around us a better way forward in how we talk about and respond to sexual assault, which is something that our culture is in dire need of right now. So let's, as the people of Jesus, be that example that the world needs. What if the church could become the safest place in the world to talk about this kind of stuff? So in closing, I pray that at least some of today is helpful to those of you in the room who are survivors of sexual assault. And to those of us who will have someone confide in us about their experience. More than anything, if this is a part of your story, I want you to know that healing is possible. Because of Jesus, healing is possible. It likely will not be easy. It likely will not be quick. It likely will not be simple, but it can happen. Jesus desires to walk with you throughout that process. We, as the people of Jesus, desire to walk with you throughout that process. So this morning, I want to pray that Jesus continues to heal and redeem and restore in and among our church family and through our church family when it comes to all of this. So for followers of Jesus in the room, when you're ready, you're invited to go to the tables all around this room as we sing and remember the one who takes away our shame and makes healing possible. And specifically to remember the moment in time at the cross where his body was broken and his blood was spilled to make all of that healing possible for those who would believe in him. So we're going to go to the tables all around this room. We're going to respond by celebrating and reflecting on that moment. So let's pray, and then we'll take communion together.